Well, today begins sort of what we call the Advent season, and so this is a time of getting ready for Christmas, and our theme has turned toward that. You can see it if you've grabbed one of the worship guides. That today we begin a series we're calling the First Christmas. When we were originally, I was thinking of doing this series, I thought we would be in the new building, and so calling it the First Christmas, that made a lot of sense. But it's First Baptist, and so every Christmas for us is always the first Christmas. But we're really not talking about ourselves today. We're talking about the first Christmas, the story that we read about in the Bible, in Luke's Gospel. And so you can see over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about Luke 2, and then Luke 2, and then Luke 2. And we're just going to walk right through that Christmas story as we find there. And maybe you know this story really well, or maybe you just kind of heard about it and you've never really carefully studied the Christmas story, and so this is really going to be an enriching time for you. But you can see what we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks. Today we're going to talk about dealing with the inconvenient. I know that never happens at Christmas time. Next week we're going to talk about as told by the angels, which you'll want to hear that story. And then we're going to talk about good news even for the down and lowly. And then we're going to talk about God's best kept secret. And then Christmas Eve we're going to be listening for Jesus on Christmas Eve. So let's begin today with dealing with the inconvenient. And so if you have a Bible or a way to access your Bible, we're going to be in Luke chapter 2. That's where we're going to be for the next several weeks. Last night, in fact, for the last few days, maybe even the last few weeks, I've just kind of been in the Christmas spirit. Maybe it's because I've been kind of getting ready, with sermons and everything for this time of the year. And so I've been, whether my kids want to or not, turning on Christmas movies every night. I mean, we've been watching them all. We've seen The Elf and, Christmas with the Cranks, and we've seen all kinds of stuff. And last night we watched 2 Christmas movies. Angela was out of town. I was like, we're going to watch 2 of them. And of course, only half the kids were there for the whole experience because they got bored with it. But we got to watch The Man Who Invented Christmas. How many of you have seen that? That movie's not like real new, but not everybody raise your hand. Apparently, I'm the only one. It's actually pretty good. So, I think it's PG even. So, that's kind of neat. But maybe you haven't seen it. So let me tell you about it. It's kind of interesting. It's the story about Charles Dickens. He's the famous writer, wrote all those books, one of the best-selling books ever. And he wrote a story about Christmas, the Christmas Carol, the ghosts of Christmas past and present and future. He wrote that. And this movie is about like how he did that, how he came about to write that incredible story. So he's called the man who invented Christmas because so many of our customs and stuff comes from Charles Dickens. But I'll be honest with you, I was a little reticent about watching this movie because of the title, right? The Man Who Invented Christmas, and it's Charles Dickens. I was like, no, I don't think he's the guy who did. But it reminds me of the moment, you may have seen this on television a few years ago, where they were over in Japan. And I don't know if you know this or not, but all around the world, people celebrate Christmas. People of all different religions. If you go to the land of Israel, they're celebrating Christmas. If you go to Europe, they're celebrating Christmas. If you go to China, they're celebrating Christmas. And on the streets of Tokyo, Japan, one of the busiest cities of the world, the streets were lit up with Christmas lights. And people were walking in and out of stores and shops buying Christmas presents. And they walked up to this lady, the TV interviewer walks up to this lady who's buying all these Christmas presents. She's in the midst of Christmas. And it walks up to her with a microphone and says, "What's the meaning of Christmas?" And this is what this lady said. She said, "I don't know. Is it the day Jesus died?" And you're just kind of like, what? Like, here's these people. They're like really going after it with Christmas. They got the lights and the stuff, but they got no clue what all this is about. I'm like, there is a sermon in there, you know what I mean? Like, what's the meaning of Christmas? Well, if you go back a few years, let's say 1700, and the year's 353, the Roman Emperor Julius I was the one that said, we're going to say December 25th is the day we celebrate Christmas. But you have to go back just not too long ago to 1832 for the first Christmas tree in the United States, the first lit Christmas tree. So a lot of the traditions are really, really new. But today, just in case you don't know what Christmas is about, I just want to tell you that the man that invented Christmas was Jesus. And we're going to read his story. It's here in Luke chapter 2. Now, as I read this passage to you, and I know you know it really well, I want you to feel the passage this morning. You know, like how you hear a song, it kind of creates the mood. I want you to try to feel what's the mood of Luke 2. Like if you're living this experience, how does this feel to you? In those days, Caesar. Now, maybe you think of salad when you hear the word Caesar. But in the ancient world, people thought of power, the ultimate authority. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. How do you feel about people issuing decrees, you know? That a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Now, how easy is that? It was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. Now, how does that feel? Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, to the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register, oh, by the way, with Mary. How does that feel? She was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for a baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in clothes, and she placed him in a feeding trough, in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. As I read this story, I think to myself, how inconvenient it is. How everything in this moment is so inconvenient. The pregnancy, the decree of Caesar, the trip to Bethlehem, the timing of it all. And I think about how we live our lives constantly seeking for the convenient, right? Like everything I do, it seems like in my life is like, well, what's the most convenient thing I can do? I come to church this morning, like how's the most convenient way I can do this, you know? Everything is about convenience in our lives. And yet this story, and in fact all of Christmas, so many times, is dealing with the inconvenient, isn't it? We like convenience so much. I thought about the guy in Louisiana several years ago who owned a funeral home, mortuary, and he decided it was a little too inconvenient for people to have to come to funerals. So he put a window panel, 5x7 window panel, and put the casket right in front of the window so that when you wanted to pay your respects to somebody, all you had to do is literally drive through. A drive-through funeral. He told the newspaper, we wanted something for people who didn't have time to get dressed. We live in the age of convenience, don't we? But everything about this story is inconvenient. And so many times Christmas is. So let's just think about what are some ways that this story intersects with our lives in this season. And I'm not going to dwell on each one of them, but we'll just hit them real fast. How about number one, the power struggle, right? That was happening then. Hey, does that ever happen in your family? Do you ever have like power struggles around Christmas time? Are we going to go here? Are we going to do this? Are we going to buy this? Or what are we going to do? In this story, the most powerful man on the planet, Caesar Augustus, was issuing a decree. If you go and you read Matthew's gospel about the birth of Jesus, you realize that everything about the birth of Jesus was a power struggle. The guy in charge in Bethlehem was the king. His name was Herod. Matthew tells us his story in Matthew 2. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which, by the way, was the city of David, the city of the king, the power. During the time of King Herod, Magi from the east, they're powerful. King Herod's powerful. They asked, where's the one who's been born king of the Jews? When we saw his star, when it rose, we've come to worship him. And King Herod heard about this. He was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And you could read the rest of that story. Because this whole scene, the whole story of Jesus is a power struggle. The birth of Jesus is a struggle between the powers of the world and the powers of God. And there's a power struggle for us today, too. Here's another way it crosses with our life. How about the budget battle? Does Christmas ever kind of like a budgeting crisis for anybody? Do you ever start going like, how are we going to afford to buy these presents for all these people and so on and so forth? It can kind of be that way. Now maybe it's just like that for us. We're the only ones. But I don't think that's true. I think everybody faces this time of year a little bit of like, This is not easy. Well, how is this a budget battle? Well, the Roman Empire was issuing a census. And there are only two reasons they had a census. One reason was they wanted to count how many men could serve in the military. They wanted to draft you to fight in their wars. The other reason was taxation. They wanted to know how much you had so they could levy taxes on you based on a percentage. And that's the way they raised all their money across the empire to run the machine of the Roman Empire. And so this whole story is itself a budget battle. Now, is Christmas anything about money? You ever heard of Black Friday? Black Friday weekend, Adobe Analytics says we just spent $59.6 billion with a B. Interesting thing is 54.4% we did it on our smartphone, online. More than half on our smartphones. We shop, we travel, we get gifts, we do food, we do parties. By the way, can I just mention this? Did you spend anything on Jesus? Did you remember that he's the reason for the season? Later on in Jesus' life, he's in the temple. In fact, he's about to die. And his main adversaries want to pin him. And it's a tax question. Should we pay taxes to the Roman Empire? And they think that if they can get him to say yes or no, he's either going to get the Romans to want to kill him or he's going to make the crowds mad because they don't want to pay the taxes. And Jesus says one of the most famous things in the entire Bible, Matthew 22:21. He says, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. In other words, pay your taxes. Everybody knows that line. But it's what he says next that people haven't really paid much attention to. He says, and to God, what is God's? We pay our taxes because if we don't, the IRS will come and take away your home. You've heard the announcements on the radio. But what about to God? Have you given back to God what is God's? The way the early Christians did this, and we've been doing it ever since, is Paul says that he did this at all of his churches. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1, he says, now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, that's Sunday, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. That's a percentage. Throughout much of the Bible, that percentage is a tenth or a tithe, 10%. That's what we do as a family. We take 10% of all of our income and we set that aside and we give that. Saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. I think it's interesting what he says on the first day of every week. How many weeks? Every week. When? Every week. You know what a lot of us probably do? I'm not going to say this about you, but maybe there's somebody who does this. Like maybe every month, maybe every once in a while, maybe when I feel really guilty and feel like I got to do something, give back to God what is God's. Here's another way this story intersects our lives. They're going lots of different places. There's a lot of travel going on here, and I'd call this, because I'm trying to be preachy today a little bit, travel trouble. The travel trouble. Everything in this story is travel trouble. The Bible's full of travel troubles. Israel wandered around for 40 years trying to find what they're going. It's kind of like driving around with my dad when I was a kid, you know. Paul, in his missionary journeys, he faces all these perils. His ship is wrecked, and he travels through open country, and he's accosted by all kinds of things. The Bible is full of the stories of people trying to get from here to there, and they have all kinds of problems. Travel trouble. Christmas feels like that to me sometimes. It feels like that old movie, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. You know, you just don't know how to get from here to there. And TSA has made everything a whole lot worse, because by the time I get through the airport security, I don't have any shoes on, I don't have any belts on, my pants are falling off, half my clothes are in some machine, all my technology is somewhere, and I'm standing there in front of a scanner. It's just strange. We face all kinds of troubles. Christmas is a story of these travel troubles. We have the couple, Mary and Joseph, traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem. In a few weeks, we're going to be in Israel. And one of the cool things to do in Nazareth is they have a little village. And in the village, they tell you about life in the first century, and they tell you the story of how Mary and Joseph went from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And there are people who are there, like today, who've made that journey. Now, if you wanted to go down that road, what you'd do is you would get in a car, and you would drive 10 miles, and you'd get there. But in that world, it didn't work that way. They say 7 days. Open country, sleeping out on the ground. I cannot imagine what it would be like for my wife and I, and her pregnant, going for 7 days. And you have drugged me out here for this? Where's the food? I mean, can you just imagine how incredibly difficult that journey would have been? Luke chapter 1 verse 26 tells us that there was not just the journey of Mary and Joseph, and there wasn't just a journey of shepherds like we'll talk about in the next couple weeks. There was also a journey of heaven to earth, the journey of angels. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, Luke 1:26 says, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went. God sent, the angel went. There was a journey from heaven to earth of the angels. Travel trouble everywhere. But finally, all of this would not be so bad for any of us. We could deal with power struggles, we can deal with budget battles, we can deal with travel trouble, as long as we have enough what? Time. And what makes this passage hard is the time crunch, isn't it? I mean, there are only 18 shopping days left till Christmas, or whatever there is. Time's running out. Opportunity is running out. When we read this story, it feels hurried to us. It did to me as I was reading it. I just felt rushed. I felt stressed as I'm reading it. And as we read this story and as we live Christmas today, it sometimes feels that way. But I want you to know something. The Apostle Paul steps out of the pages of the Bible with a clock in his hand in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. And it's God's clock. And he lets us look at the perfect timing of God. You know, God's clock doesn't work like ours. Tick, 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 tick. That's chronological time. His is a kairos time, the Greek word for the season of time. And listen to what Paul says as he describes God's timing about this moment that seems so inconvenient to all of us. When the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law. The word full time, set time, is pleroma in Greek. It means like you're filling something up, you're filling a container up, and it gets all the way to the top, and now it's the perfect time. Everything seemed inconvenient in this story, but God had a perfect time. What about you today? This morning may seem like an inconvenient time for God to intersect your life, but maybe this is just the right time for God to finally say to you, and you to finally hear, and you to finally say, okay, God, I'm going to do what you want me to do. Scrooge woke up. Do you remember that in the Christmas Carol? That night he had seen the ghosts of Christmas past and the ghosts of Christmas present and the ghosts of Christmas future. He'd seen what all of us are curious to see. His whole life, right, lived out before him. The question was going to be if when he woke up, would he take the message to heart? But do you remember what he said? Bah, humbug. It wasn't real. It was just undigested beef. He said, I got more gravy around me than I've got a grave. What about you today? Will you take this message to heart?